Hello and welcome to the BGC podcast. I'm Jared Callahan, founder and CEO of BGC Industry. International background screening is often seen as a black box, especially for US-based organizations conducting checks in other countries. Here to help us unpack the mysteries are two fantastic subject matter experts. Kerstin Bagus has been in the screening environment for almost 40 years and now works for NetForce Global, which is a provider of global screening data to background screeners. Her focus has been on global screening since 2008. Kerstin's passion is sharing her experience with screening companies and their customers. Welcome, Kerstin.
Thank you.
Elisha McCann has worked in the screening space for close to a decade and has extensive end-user experience ranging from investigating caseloads and scaling global programs to managing day-to-day vendor operations and developing internal safety policy. She currently leads internal screening standards for Uber's global safety operations encompassing the rides and eats businesses. Welcome, Elisha.
Thanks, Jared. Good to talk to you today.
All right, so let's dive into just what international background screening actually is and looks like. So to do that, we're going to walk through the fundamentals, and specifically Kerstin is going to walk us through that. Sort of the what it is, the so what, and what types of companies are engaging suppliers of international backgrounds. And she'll lay out the types of screenings that are available and challenges with each. So Kerstin, take it away.
So the term international is also interchangeably used as with global. Some companies will have different definitions for either of them, international or global, but I tend to see them as both the same. And there's two main flavors of that. So the first one is when you're in a particular country and you're screening an individual who's spent time outside of your country. They've lived, worked, studied, something more than just being a tourist, where you want to take a look at that background that is outside of your home country. So for example, if you have an employer and they're located in the US and the candidate is located in the US, and that person may have grown up in Singapore, let's say they went to school in India, they worked in London, and you need to verify that maybe past criminal history in some of those locations, you want to verify their employment history, you want to verify their education history. So I look at that as more importing information. So you're importing information to your home country. But then there's a second flavor of that where you have an organization, multinational organization, and they're setting up a screening program in their locations outside of their home country. So again, that would be a U.S. headquartered company, and maybe they have operations in Canada, Mexico, and the Netherlands, and they've decided to globalize their maybe their employment screening and their background screening program. And so you're really screening people in those other countries, but you're doing it somewhat with the lens of that U.S.-based organization. One thing I would caution you to do is, as you're setting up these kinds of programs, and even when you're talking about international screening, don't label it as foreign screening, because the term foreign is going to be very situational. I like to think of it as where your feet are. So if I'm here in the United States and I'm going to do a, quote, foreign background check from Canada, importing those records from Canada into the U.S., but if I'm in Canada, a foreign background check is actually a U.S. background check. So sometimes people will say we have domestic and we have international, but what's domestic and international is going to vary according to where you are. So be careful about that term foreign. It's more cumbersome, but you could say non-U.S. and U.S. if you're basing your program like that, or out of country or in country or something, but find some other terminology other than foreign. So one thing is I would also try and be a little bit more broad about the entity that is screening, the user of that screening services. So I don't always focus on employers. I often refer to the individuals who are being screened as subjects or data subjects, because they're not all employees or potential employees. Some of them could be job candidates. Some of them are current employees. We do, well, a lot of screeners do screening programs for principals of organizations. Maybe you're going to engage in some kind of a joint venture, or you're looking for directors, or you're looking for some kind of funding, or maybe partnering, or even vendor management, where you might want to screen either the vendors or the individual entities who are doing that, or sometimes just individuals who are going to do some work for you. So they're not always employees. So if you do hear me use the term subject, that is because it's going to be a little bit more fluid according to the individual that we're screening. Interestingly enough, there's quite a few schools, higher educational facilities, who do screening of certain job candidates when they come either from their home country or even from outside their home country. So this even goes into people who are looking for certain educational experiences. Another thing that, especially when we compare it to the screening done in the United States, the level of employee that is screened tends to be much higher than the level employee that is screened in the United States. So in the U.S., criminal record checks, social traces are quick, they're inexpensive. We have such a litigious environment here. If an employer doesn't do the very basic background search, then they could have some negligent entrustment issues. So just about everybody is background screened to some degree, even extending through the volunteer organizations. Outside of the U.S., screening is conducted to a much higher job position. So that has impacts on a lot of things, everything from the hit rate or the derogatory result rate is a bigger area that we see something, and then also just in how you approach the individuals and sometimes the cost of your program. But when we look at the typical searches that are done, verifications come to mind as the number one types of searches: employment verifications and education verifications. And those are critical too when you're looking at just verifying the background of any individual. Criminal record searches are often requested, and there's an issue of where you can do them. They're not available everywhere, so sometimes there's some criminal alternative products that might be used. For companies that are located outside the U.S., again, those multinational employers, we see a product called directorship searches to see if the individual was either a director or had fiduciary responsibility. Sometimes they'll come along with sanctions. Financial services companies, of course, we see a lot of sanctions searches there. There are, in many areas, there's specific financial sanctions products. We often see more use of credit or bankruptcy searches in that area. If the company is in healthcare, we see a greater focus on the education and possibly professional license area. And then if the company has anything to do with transportation or gig services that involve driving, then we see a driving check is a very key component to that search. So in terms of the challenges, and there are many challenges, which kind of makes it fun, but when we screen information using information from outside of the U.S., or if we're screening individuals who are located outside of the U.S., the main struggles everybody has is, first of all, the cost is much higher. You don't get a 50-cent criminal record search outside the U.S. You don't get a 50-cent anything outside the U.S. The turnaround time tends to be much higher. We kind of joke in international that, to us, an instant search is 24 hours. So the turnaround time can sometimes even span months, although it usually is somewhere around, I'd say maybe 4 days to possibly a week or a week and a half. Obviously, with certain circumstances, it can go longer than that. It is much more labor intensive to get the information. So in the United States, we have a lot of databases. So you've got employment history databases. You have education history databases. There's several solid proprietary criminal record databases, those multi-jurisdictional searches that you have. This is not something that you find outside the U.S. There's a few of the employment and school databases out there, but very, very few, and they're not as comprehensive as what we have here in the U.S. So that's what really drives the cost and the turnaround time. There is also a growing infrastructure supporting international screening outside the U.S., but it is not nearly at the maturity level that we have here in the U.S. And in some areas, it is not at all at a good maturity level. There's a lot of paper pushing going on. The other thing is most people aren't prepared for this if you're not used to doing international screening, but the ordering requirements can be intense, much more intense than what we're used to in the U.S. So in the U.S., when you want to do just about any search, all you need is the person's name, full name, middle name, alias names maybe. You need their date of birth, you need their address, and oftentimes you need their social security number. And a notice and a consent has to be given but that document generally does not have to be given when the search is ordered. So it's really very little information, and in some cases you can trigger a lot of stuff just by having the name. There's just automatic searches that start from that. Outside of the U.S., totally different environment. So we almost always have to provide a copy of that notice and consent along with that background search. The idea of having, I get a lot of questions lately about electronic signatures. So click signatures, not going to be accepted outside the U.S. There will be a little bit more luck with having the finger or the mouse signature, but click signatures won't happen. There are oftentimes very special forms. Sometimes these forms can be extremely daunting. They can be 3, 4, 5, 6 pages long. And then we may need to have a copy of ID. It may need to be a very specific copy of ID. It may need to have the front and the back. It may need to have multiple IDs. It may need to also have copies of something that proves the address of the individual. Sometimes forms have to be attested to by third parties. Sometimes we need, well, almost for many countries, we need to have, for an education verification, we need to have a copy of the person's diploma. Sometimes we need to have a mark sheet, which is kind of like a transcript. Sometimes that transcript must have a certain education ID on it, which may not even be found on the front of the document. It could be on the back of the document, on the bottom, on the top. So, so these ordering requirements, really, it is so important to understand the ordering requirements before you start with a particular search so that there's just less back and forth for everybody. And so I've told you about all the stuff we need to do the search. And you might be tempted to say, well, you know, for every search that we're going to do, we'll automatically get a copy of ID. If it's an education verification, let's automatically get a copy of the diploma. We're done. It'll save everybody time. Don't do it. Do not do it. There are very strict privacy regulations outside the U.S., and in almost every privacy regulation, there's this focus on over-collection. So if you collect information that you don't need for the purpose of which you're collecting it, then you're in trouble with the privacy laws. And if you ask for a copy of ID that may have an ID number on it, and you don't need that ID number for that search, you're in that over-collection situation. So even though it's a pain to understand what's needed, and sometimes you don't know what's needed until the search has been ordered, but really the safest, the best, and the best, most ethical thing to do is to reduce your data collection and only do it for what you need to have it. So I'm not even done with some of the challenges. And again, people who are doing international, we're used to this. It isn't all that bad. But if you're not used to doing international, these are some of the things that can be a struggle. Timing is a challenge. So you have time zone issues. This week already, I've had 2 calls that have gone till almost 10 o'clock at night because I'm having calls in Asia. Sometimes you have to get up at 5 in the morning because you're having calls in some other time zone. My favorite customer demand is on a Friday at 2 p.m. my time, when they demand that I contact our French supplier and have a talk with them about something. It's like at that time, it's going to be, 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night in France. They're not there. They're not working. And in some countries, and we see this very often, much more than we see in the U.S., when it's a weekend for them. They're not working evenings and days and the days off and the holidays as we often are here in America. So when people take time off, they take time off. Speaking of holidays, there are so many more holidays outside the U.S. I mean, people, they celebrate all sorts of things. There's almost a holiday somewhere every day. And some of these holidays will span multiple days. There are holidays called Golden Week, and they're a week long, and everything shuts down, and they're not working during that time. Then there's vacations. People take vacations, and sometimes the entire country would empty out. So in Southern Europe, we always joke, nothing's going to happen in Italy in August. All of Southern Europe really goes out. In normal times, they would physically leave and go on vacation. Now they're going on vacation. So that's going to impact verifications as well. So keep those things in mind. And then lastly, you have to think a little bit about culture. So we can't just impose one country's values on another and assume that a background check is going to be fulfilled in the same way. So calling for a verification request every day for 5 days in a row or 10 days in a row is actually going to get you on kind of like a no-fly list, like a no-return call list. They're not going to call you back just because that's seen as obnoxious. So you have to really understand the nuances of the culture that you're working with when you're asking them to provide you some more information. And that will greatly impact the willingness of people to work with you. So that's kind of a highlight of some of the challenges and what people need to know when they're engaging in international background checks.
Wow, thank you for that walkthrough. I think we're all ready for our PhD in international background checks after you walked us through sort of how it all works. Thank you for that. So now let's pivot a little bit to some of the challenges for international background checks, but specifically from some of the things you've already touched on Kerstin, but Elisha, I'll turn to you. As far as cultural, compliance, and operational challenges are concerned, can you sort of walk us through that from your perspective there at Uber?
Yeah, sure. I think it's nice to hear that Kerstin, as in a different piece of the industry, is actually experiencing a lot of the same cultural, compliance, and sort of operational challenges that we kind of as end users also experience. So she touched on a lot of the really key ones, and I would really just reiterate a lot of those as well. I think for one, it's absolutely right. As compared to the U.S., you are almost certain, right, to encounter differences and even just the attitudes and kind of the perceptions of, with respect to screening purpose, even around expectations of whether sometimes a screening is even a helpful mitigation, risk mitigation tool, right? Sometimes folks might even think screenings, for example, are impolite in different parts of the world. And so really important that you have a sense of what those kind of cultural expectations are and what sort of challenges you might encounter when you're, thinking about screening in different parts of the world. Absolutely. And from an operational perspective, I think the cost and the turnaround time piece is huge, right? That's going to vary really from sort of the more standard expectations that we have from a US perspective. And I think it's right to, and this is important from an end user perspective, to amend your expectations around some of the customer service expectations that we've become accustomed to in the US with, availability of data, kind of supporting that level of service. That's not going to be the case in every part of the world that you're working on international screenings with. And then I think the cultural aspect is also really important when you're thinking about what kind of adjudication criteria you should be applying in the various markets too, right? There's inevitably going to be differences here. So that's really important, I think, to take in mind. And then, I think a big one also is even the expectation that you might be able to find a, credible or capable service provider or vendor in some of the markets, depending on where your business is operating or where you're trying to get screening information, right? So don't take that for granted. And I'll probably say a lot more about that later. I think tactically too, the scale of your organization is actually going to dictate a lot of your operational needs, probably also in terms of operational challenges, right? So, questions like, is your organization equipped as it is now to work and liaise with these international vendors, right? There's a lot of daily operations that you'll need to think about maintaining. So how should you set that up in your org? Do you need to have internal teams that sit locally in markets to best serve that function, or is that something that can be done centrally? Another question is, do you have a sense of what processes outside of the U.S. your candidates or your subjects might actually have to interact with themselves, right? And are those expectations also communicated to them appropriately? Do they know what they need to do to help the screening process along? Obviously to support type interactions, are your support teams equipped to handle and troubleshoot inbound issues about screenings? Are they able to do that in the local language appropriately? So, I think a lot of these things sound obvious when we say them out loud, but I think what's really important is that when you're coming from experience with a US centric screening program, not to try to fit your international expectations into those US expectations. I do think that they can be really helpful. I think, to Kerstin's point, there's a lot of maturity, longevity, and sort of sophistication in the US screenings space. And so that can be really helpful as sort of a guiding framework to some extent, right? But you're inevitably going to be sort of thinking about this with a global lens, with a local lens in a lot of cases, and not just trying to fit sort of a square peg in a round hole, right, as they say. So,
got it. Thanks, Elisha, for that. And so, Kerstin, I'm wondering, what feedback do clients of yours share when it comes to these cultural, compliance, and operational challenges that Elisha sort of talked us through?
Yeah, so my clients and I have all learned a tremendous amount over the years, and I think what I've learned from them and what we've all learned together as we've grown in international information is be very cautious about taking a US-based approach to international screening. Elisha also alluded to this too, that you want to take a look at that screening not only from what your US lens is, but what's the local lens. It may not be common to do something in a country, and that's fine if you want to introduce it, but that top-down American approach sometimes will create a wall that you will not be able to overcome. So be collaborative and listen and introduce new ideas using the culture of that location, not the American kind of a culture. The best feedback I get, though, is I get some feedback from customers, obviously, and working closely with them, but the best feedback I get is from my suppliers, my supply chain, and then just in general, members of the community, of the background screening community. And we have an industry association, the PBSA, that has many international members, and I work very closely to just connect with them, help them, and also learn from them. And that's what helps to understand the cultural situation as well as some of the compliance challenges and even what's the norm in a particular area. So from a compliance standpoint, this is a huge, huge challenge. And the EU probably has set the highest bar. I think it goes all the way back to 1995 with their initial data protection directive. And so many countries have worked to create data protection requirements and legislation that is equal to or substantially similar to the EU because they want to be trading partners and you want to trade with information. So you have to have an equal level of data protection. Outside the U.S., data protection is often seen as a fundamental human right. And there are rigid rules about who can access data, when it can be accessed, how it can be accessed, how it can be transferred across country borders. This is so, for use of a better term, foreign to us here in America. But it is really, really critical outside the U.S. And the individual data subjects, they know their data protection rights. And they will push on them and they will challenge them. Even in the employment situation where you'd think somebody wouldn't bring up a challenge like that, they will challenge it. So it is really, really critical to understand the data protection environment in a country that you're operating from. In the U.S., we do have very strict data protection requirements. They're just not labeled as such, and they're not federal. So that's what causes other countries to take a dimmer view or maybe not understand the protections that we have in place. So our protections are very sectoral. It all depends on what you're doing with the data. So if you're doing something with employment and you're using a third party, then the FCRA is there. If it has to do with financial banking information, then the GLBA is there. If it has to do with driving information, then the DPPA is there. And then you have some of the state information. There's been a lot lately about California and their specific privacy regulation. So we have huge, huge protections in place. They're just complex and they're not as well known outside the U.S. And that's going to make companies and individuals and organizations outside the U.S. look a little bit more critically at what happens here. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of education there as well. Another key difference is in the U.S. we're very litigious, and we put programs in place in part to defend or protect against some litigation. Outside of the U.S., you don't see that same litigious feel and that litigious requirement. So you're not putting programs in place to protect yourself from a lawsuit. You're putting programs in place to address a particular need or a particular risk. So the risk of lawsuits is not quite as large in many countries. And then, in terms of regulator power, there's also a challenge with that. So, in the U.S., we have regulators that have a lot of power, and not only can they name and shame, but there can be considerable fines associated with things. And that can keep organizations in line and be a key area for why an organization will want to meet a particular requirement, in addition to their own ethics, but that is a key driver. In some countries, we see now in the EU, they do have significant fining ability, and that was a key thing that happened with the GDPR, the latest privacy regulation. In other countries, the privacy regulators may only be able to name and shame. However, I will tell you that more and more countries are trying to get that fining ability. They see how successful it's been here in the US and how successful it's been in the EU. So that is a big difference, and again, another reason why you really need to understand the privacy regulations if you're screening in another country. And I think the biggest single piece of advice I can give you is just don't treat everything the same as it is in your home country. If you're located in the United States, the screening is going to be different than it is in other countries. If you're in Canada, the screening is going to be different than it is in other countries. So, use the things that you know from the screening in your home country, but then have much more open-mindedness about what's going to be allowable, how it's going to be done, and how it's going to be received. So the second piece is that, and I alluded to it a little bit when we talked about some of the challenges, is that screening is not going to be as straightforward outside of the U.S. as it is in the U.S. So sometimes whether something is available, a particular background check is available, isn't even all that clear, and people are making interpretations. So you may have one provider that makes an interpretation one way and says it's not available, and another provider who says it is available. Neither one are wrong. They have a different viewpoint and a different level of interpretations, and maybe even different processes, sometimes even different permissions that allows one to do it versus not another one. So when you see this disconnect, this discord between what one entity tells you versus another, you have to dig into it to understand what the cause is. And it's not as clear-cut as just saying one is wrong and one is not wrong. So, a lot of times people will ask a question just in general, how is so-and-so in international? And the answer is always, it depends, because you're dealing with some 240 countries and even multiple jurisdictional breakdowns in that and different levels of screening sophistication. So, people will say, can you do a criminal check in Poland? It depends. Where's the applicant? Where's the employer? Where are you getting the data from? What position? So the real thing with international screening is be flexible, be open-minded, and then work together. Be a key partner.
Got it. So we touched a little bit on the compliance of international background checks, and I guess now would be a good time to sort of hone in on specific regulations internationally for TNC, so transportation network companies or ride sharing. So Elisha, let's ask you. So what regulations do TNCs have to consider when it comes to international background checks?
Gosh, that's a great question, Jared. There are plenty of regulatory frameworks around the world that, say a lot of different things about screenings, ranging from prescribing what types of screenings we need to do, kind of the method of those screenings, specific requirements that need to be in those screenings, sometimes timing of the screenings, even eligibility criteria, right, and reporting requirements. In some cases, there are regulations in certain countries that, or even at lower levels of jurisdictions, that will say things that we cannot disqualify different earners for, right? So lots of different regulatory frameworks, extremely varied. These are at the municipal level sometimes, the state, provincial level sometimes, country market level. So it really just depends on the country that you're talking about, to be honest. And And, they're also still pretty new and constantly kind of evolving and changing in many parts of the world. So, I, for one, am really appreciative of the deep expertise that my legal team brings to our programs. But, I would also say there are a lot of places in the world today where, rideshare and delivery companies are still largely unregulated, right? And that's really the case for a lot of different sharing economy type, gig economy type businesses as well. So we don't necessarily take the view that regulatory compliance is kind of the end of our responsibility, right? Instead, we look to kind of leverage our internal frameworks to think about, what are the unique needs of our business, and really think beyond regulations to develop screening programs that, more aim to meet the needs of our business, but also in some ways aim to kind of up-level the industry as well. I think a good example of this, probably a big prominent one for a lot of the audience here today, is the continuous screening product that we implemented in the United States a couple of years ago, right? And that was really thinking about what are the unique needs of Uber's business, and where can we up-level our screening programs? We're just always, thinking about investing in safety in that way. And I think if you're really looking at the letter of the regulations all the time, while of course it's imperative that there's compliance there, right? I would caution against thinking of that as sort of the ceiling.
Got it. Yeah, that's an awesome perspective. So, Kerstin, now that Elisha's kind of talked through some of her organization's unique challenges, how can hiring organizations stay on top of these new regulations, either industry specific like Uber, or just overall as far as a hiring organization is concerned?
Well, I can speak at least from my own personal experience. Read, and keep reading. I am signed up for multiple emails from law firms all around the world. I'm signed up from government entities. They sometimes have listservs and things. I'm very active in the Primary Privacy Association, IAPP. I've signed up for all of their announcements, and they have literally these things come out every day as a daily digest, and they have weekly announcements, and then they have special announcements, and they have podcasts and training programs. And I'm also extremely active in our industry association, the PBSA. And, so it's not a matter of just being a member of that group or a particular group, but it's being active, because that's where you liaise with people from different countries, and the real information sharing happens. So being more active in the key associations and also with companies outside of your local area is going to be important. And I don't know, did I mention that I read a lot?
Very good. Yes, point taken. So we talked through a lot about sort of the challenges, and maybe next we can sort of pivot to is, I guess, a call to action, for lack of a better term. And I'll start with you, Elisha. So both of you have sort of been there, done that. And Elisha, from your perspective, what steps should hiring organizations take to either begin an international screening program or optimize one if they've got one going already?
Well, how many hours do we have? No, I'll, of course, there's a ton here. I'll talk about it, maybe a couple that I find foundational for global screening programs. I think Kerstin's absolutely right. Inevitably, to be able to conduct international screening successfully, you're going to need to establish really strong partnerships, right, with trusted experts that can really help you navigate some of these challenges that are going to arise in such a varied landscape. And, I think as an end user, ultimately, if it's not abundantly clear to you, right, why your organization is pursuing screenings, it's going to be really difficult for you to build efficient, comprehensive, and compliant programs. So, as a matter of priority, I think it's really important as an end user to have a really well-defined screening philosophy built in really to a internal policy that will really help you guide how your programs are developed and governed. And you're going to constantly be referring back to that, right? With these sort of operational challenges that will come up, you're going to need to refer back to some type of guiding framework. Otherwise, you're going to have you're not gonna have any consistency on your global programs for the first, thing. And that's probably not okay for your business if you're a global business, because you probably have some type of a global brand, right? So I can't recommend that enough. At Uber in particular, we have such broad global operations that we have to take a very global approach to our screening programs. But the consistency that I mentioned is also really key for us as well, given the scale of our brand. And so we need to have a policy and kind of a framework that allows for the local nuance that we've been talking about. And again, that's important for us, for our specific business, but it's something that I really would challenge all end users to think about for their own businesses that have an international presence as well. So, have a deep understanding of your business and the risks that your business faces that screenings can help mitigate. And then just spend time developing your organizational philosophy and, make sure you're working with the right internal stakeholders cross-functionally, to get them bought in, to get their input, and also to get the leadership in your organization's buy-in as well. I think, the second thing, won't spend too much time on this, but seek counsel, right? You need to understand the screening requirements that are relevant to your business as well. We talked about some of the regulatory requirements for T&Cs, but you need to understand that for your business as well. And again, this is, pretty straightforward, but it can get really complicated really quickly, depending on how, many different markets you operate in, et cetera. So you're going to need to be aware of sort of the parameters within which you're going to build the screening program to even have, basic success in this area. So seek counsel. And then I think a third area that I would really recommend is to spend time conducting, thorough due diligence for the potential vendors and partners, these experts that you're going to seek out in the markets. That are, inevitably going to, claim to provide services in these places, right? So spend a lot of time here. Not all vendors are created equally. I think that's something that I've learned from experience and something that's really worth spending your time on, right? And I think often in the end user space, I hear folks thinking about vendor partnerships from maybe one or two dimensions, mainly sort of what services do you offer and how much is it going to cost me? And I think that, obviously these are important factors, right? We're running businesses and things cost money and that makes sense. But so is quality, right? When we're talking about screening, so is quality, so is accuracy. Account management, that's huge. That's actually something that can make or break, depending on the scale of your organization as well. Turnaround time is obviously key. We talked about that a little bit. And then technical expertise, depending on, the scale and sort of how you're trying to run screenings. That's huge for Uber, given our scale, but, these things are all really important. But I would really argue too, one thing that is probably not as obvious to a lot of end users, maybe just starting out in the international space, is that you should evaluate the subject matter expertise of a vendor as well, right? Do some research yourself, but push and prod on how much they know and how comfortable they are with some of the different infrastructure in these different marketplaces as well. And then partnership fit, something that I call partnership fit, right? Is this someone that, is this an organization that you can really work with that aligns with sort of the philosophies of your business? Is there a reputational fit, right? So spend a lot of time here. And I think it's important because realistically, the partners that you're going to be engaging with for screening processing, for screening processes, they're going to have discretion, right? At some point, day to day. So you're going to set expectations for them. And those are going to be in accordance with the needs of your business uniquely, but you're going to need to have an established trust here in order to really run the operations efficiently, right? Otherwise, you're going to be on the phone with them all day long. No one's going to be happy. Maybe Kerstin will put you on the no-fly list. We don't want that to happen, right? It's kind of a waste of everyone's time. And I think the best partners that I've had the chance to work with are those that really understand your organization in a way that allows for them to, offer solutions, bring solutions to you that meet your unique business challenges. They know when to kind of escalate things for your awareness and for your input, but they also know when to manage on their own in line with the expectations that you've set. So, it's describing a little bit of a dance here, this trust, and it doesn't happen overnight, right? This is enabled because as a client, like I mentioned, you've already done the work to develop your screening philosophy. That's allowed you to clearly articulate those unique needs that you have. And right, you've spent time upfront evaluating that partnership comprehensively. So those are sort of the key things that I would say from, just thinking about strategically developing a global screening program. I think when it comes to kind of the optimization of a screening program, right, if you're trying to take a fresh look, maybe, I mean, this is ongoing. I think maybe that is the fun part of screenings for all of us on the call today. I think it's probably hard for a lot of us that work in screenings to imagine a screening program that's done, right? Inherently, I would advocate for a principle in sort of the philosophy that I've been talking about that you're going to want to establish about continuous improvement and build that into your screening program governance. As far as identifying issues and things that you can optimize, different efficiencies, you can do kind of an end-to-end review of, the operational process. I think also reviewing customer support tickets for those of us that get that type of inbound is super insightful to, there's tons of valuable insights in there about how your program is being perceived, how, it's functioning operationally, et cetera. And then another thing you can do is really leverage the vendors and the partnerships that I'm talking about, right? Sit down with them and ask questions about how your program stacks up to others, maybe in the industry, and what recommendations they might have to improve. So you're going to go through all the trouble to vet the partners thoroughly, make sure you're leveraging them for their expertise.
Excellent. Fascinating perspective from an end user perspective point of view. So Kerstin, now that we've heard from Elisha from sort of an end user perspective, maybe you can kind of walk us through from a provider or technically a furnisher's perspective, what's an overview of the steps companies should take in setting up their program internationally?
It's interesting because we have very, very similar philosophies, even though, we're kind of on different ends of the fulfillment perspective. It's just very interesting to see that. And my favorite statement is the whole continuous improvement part. That is so important. And even as a furnisher, as a provider, you need to have continuous improvement. Things that maybe didn't work so well, or maybe the opportunities change, the laws change, the access change, you have to go punt. And then sometimes you just change your mind. There's been times when I said, no, we shouldn't do this. And then after some debate and maybe challenges, I've rethought it and said, well, maybe it can be okay. And changing your mind does not mean that what you did was wrong before. It means you have a different perspective and the situation changed. And that's all part of continuous improvement. So I'd say that what she just described has been exactly what I've found to be the most successful programs with customers. I've worked at companies where I have worked directly with end users, and I've been that account rep. So having that true partnership and understanding is really, really key. I would say too, have a background screening policy in place. And know, why are you screening? What are the risks that you're trying to avoid? What is it you're trying to accomplish with screening? And have an idea, at least loosely, for the different employee groups, what searches are going to be done. Whether if you're in the hospitality industry, front of the house, back of the house administration. If you're in financial, regulated, non-regulated, that kind of stuff. Have some idea of what the different elements are in each jurisdiction, and they can be different. And then you have some decisioning guidelines because remember, your screening provider is not making the decision on what to do. Anything they're going to do is taking your instructions. So if you want to have some kind of a flagging mechanism so that you can prioritize or maybe even filter what result goes to whom, you have to give that decisioning information to your provider. They can't make it up. And then have some ideas of how you're going to manage exceptions. There are always going to be an exception. Don't put a program together for an exception. Put a program together and then have a mechanism to deal with exceptions. And every exception is going to be different, every one of them. And if you have a lot of exceptions, then maybe you need to rethink your program and do that continuous improvement. Just like she said, look through your tickets, a great way to redo your program. Who's responsible for the program? Who's responsible for the exceptions? Who's responsible for problem requests? You have to have a really close relationship with legal, whether it's your in-house counsel or your outside counsel, but be able to have that thoughtful review of, again, why are we doing it? Are we allowed to do, within our philosophy, what we're doing in each of the countries? And also have reasonable expectations about your screening provider. Your screening provider is an expert in how to do the background screen. They are the expert in knowing where to go, what information is required, how to physically get that search done, how to safely deliver that information to you, and how to take care of the rights of the data subject. They are not a law firm. I don't know of any background screening company that's a law firm. They cannot provide legal advice. They may be able to give you guidelines for what to put in a notice and consent, but they can't give you a legally valid notice and consent for every one of your jurisdictions. They may be able to tell you, here's roughly where you can do something, why you can do it, what the legal basis of processing is in a particular country, but they can't tell you down to your specific positions, you can do this search in this country for this purpose. So, have that reasonable expectation. And then your screening provider will probably have a list of available searches. It can easily be 2,000 to 5,000 searches. Remember, each search in each country is a different search. So if you ask them, what kind of searches can you do, they're going to give you this list. That does not mean that that's the list of what searches you can do for every position, because as I mentioned before, if the individual is living in Poland and your employer is in Poland, your ability to do a criminal record search is going to be vastly less than if the person is living in the United States and the employer is in the United States and they just had history in Poland and you're importing that data. There you have a greater breadth of when you can do a criminal record search. But everybody's going to have that Poland criminal record search on their list of services. You need to understand what you can do in your situation for that job position. Have a mechanism in place to collect that additional information. Remember, we need a lot of information. So how are you going to get it from the candidate? And sometimes that information, you won't know you need it until afterwards. If we look at education verifications, even if we look at a single country, maybe in a single country in general, a copy of the diploma is not needed. But for these 5 schools, they want a copy of the diploma. And for these 3 schools, they want a copy of an ID. And you won't need that. You won't know that until you've actually started that verification and contacted that school. Unless the providers have a lot of experience with the school, then they might know it ahead of time. But for the most part, you're going to get these surprises. So the search has been started. Your candidate's chomping at the bit to be able to start their work. How are you going to have that communication from your provider? We need more information. The document isn't clear. The ID was cut off. How are you going to get that to the candidate, and how are you going to get it back to your provider? If you think through that process ahead of time with your provider, it just makes it much easier because it is going to happen.
Very good. So we've actually talked about a lot on this podcast. We've talked about just the fundamentals of what an international background check or screening looks like. Some of the challenges from both the end users, but also the furnisher's perspective, and then how to establish and improve an international screening process or program. So as we sort of wrap up here, what I'd like to do is kind of talk about some walkaway points from both of your perspectives. So Kerstin, I'll start with you. What walkaway points do you want the audience to remember after today's podcast?
I know we talked about a lot of the challenges and the obstacles with international screening. At the end of the day, though, international screening is a must. If you omit a person's international experience just because they had it and it's just too difficult to be able to try and get that verification done in that other country, you are actually creating a lot of risk for your organization. You're missing a key check of what somebody's stated capabilities and information is, and you're also creating a disadvantage for your candidates who have only that one in-country history. So if you only screen U.S.-based candidates with U.S.-based data, then you've actually created a higher bar for those U.S.-based candidates, since they don't the non-U.S. folks, the people that have history outside the U.S., they're only going to be partially screened. So you're missing information and you're creating a disadvantage for your population. I know, just know that international screening is complex. It changes a lot. It's not as mature a program outside the U.S. as it is in the U.S., although in many countries it is quite mature. Canada, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, UK, very, very mature screening programs there. And even in the areas where it hasn't been so mature, sometimes the developing countries, there are background screening companies there, and they have put an infrastructure in place, and it is getting easier all the time. So the complexity is there, but it's not insurmountable, and you actually get used to it. To those of us in international screening, we don't think that that's too much of an obstacle. Successful programs have incredibly strong partnerships between the requesters, between those end users and their screening providers. That is, to me, the key to the most successful programs I've ever worked in. And then the screening providers have very close relationships with their supply chain. I don't even like to call vendors because these people are truly partners in making it successful for me to deliver to my customer. So, it's that joint working together to solve the problem and get the customer what they need. And the more everybody works together on the same problem, so the end user has a question, I research it, my providers help me get that information, understanding the unique needs or maybe flavor of that end user, and then we all get the answer back to the end user so that the end user can get the candidate screened and the candidate can do what they're out there to do. So that's really the end goal of what we're trying to do. And then, just like I said, the true partnerships are there to solve a problem. The problem is we have to review this individual's background check. How do we do it? So even more so when you have a company, an end user like Uber, there's some very unique needs there. So true partnerships will really take a look at that problem and then continuously come up with new and different ways to be able to solve that problem. So it's always, like she said, always working on improving that program and coming up with a different view.
Right. So Elisha, from your unique perspective, what walkaway points do you want the audience to remember?
Yeah, so I would say, first and foremost, don't expect your screening vendors or partners, right, to have all the answers or do all the work for you, right? Take the time, like I mentioned, to develop a screening philosophy that's going to serve as your guiding framework for your programs, right? Ultimately, these are your programs, mitigating risk to your business, and right, enabling organizational consistency that allows for this local nuance that we've been talking about. The need for customization. I would also really just reinforce the idea that you should be doing your research. You should be doing research on the markets in which you operate, or that you're going to be doing screenings in. So learn about the local infrastructure, learn about the criminal justice system, some of the cultural nuances, regulatory requirements and various limitations. Again, you're going to need these very capable vendors and partners to help you navigate, but you're going to also need a basic literacy to vet them, right? So there is research to do, roll up your sleeves and spend some time there. And then again, spend the time upfront to vet your partners comprehensively before entering into partnerships with them. This is, in my experience, really pays off tenfold. It's kind of the hire slow, fire fast mentality, right? It works here too. Because you're really looking, as we've mentioned, for partners that provide both the subject matter expertise and insight into these various industry best practices, but that are also able and willing, right, to problem solve alongside you. So, if you remember nothing else, these are your programs. Take ownership of them, and then leverage experts.
Fantastic. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. I want to thank you both, Kerstin and Elisha. You've been amazing. I learned just a ton of information, and I've been doing background checks for a long time as well. I also want to thank you, the audience, for your participation in viewership and also listening to the podcast. I would encourage you to share the podcast over your various social media channels. And again, thank you very much, and we are signing off.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks, Kerstin.